The night Fairmont crest glittered under a velvet sky. No one suspected that behind the polished smiles, carefully curated reputations, and soft clinking of champagne glasses, a secret was coiling tighter than anyone could imagine, one that would soon unravel lives, fracture loyalties, and expose the fragile truths people had buried for years, because Shanice and Carlton, two people who outwardly seemed to exist in completely separate emotional orbits, had been carrying something explosive. Between them, something that wasn't just a fleeting mistake or a moment of weakness, but a deeply rooted, dangerously complicated connection that stretched further back than anyone realized, and it began long before the whispers, before the suspicious glances, before Nicole noticed the subtle shifts in Carlton's behavior. The way his voice softened when Shanice entered a room, the way Shanice avoided eye contact just a second too long, as if holding back a storm behind her carefully composed exterior. At first, it seemed like nothing more than coincidence. After all, Fairmont Crest thrived on coincidence, chance encounters, and overlapping lives. But this was different. This was deliberate, and the deeper one looked, the clearer it became that Shanice and Carlton were bound by something far more dangerous than attraction. They shared a past, one that had been deliberately erased, rewritten, and buried under layers of lies, and the truth was, years ago, before Carlton had built his life, before Shanice had reinvented herself, they had been everything to each other, not just lovers, but co-conspirators in a decision that would change both their lives forever. It all traced back to a summer that neither of them ever spoke about, a summer filled with reckless choices, desperate dreams, and a secret that neither of them could afford to let surface, because that secret wasn't just emotional, it was tangible, living, and breathing, and its existence threatened to dismantle everything they had worked so hard to build, and for years, they had succeeded in keeping it hidden, until fate, or perhaps guilt, brought Shanice back into Carlton's orbit, igniting a chain reaction neither of them could control. At first, they played their roles perfectly, distant acquaintances with polite smiles and carefully measured conversations, but beneath that surface, tension simmered, memories resurfaced, and emotions they had long suppressed began to claw their way back to the surface. And it wasn't long before their interactions became charged with something unmistakable, something that others began to notice, especially Nicole, who had always trusted her instincts, and those instincts were now screaming that something wasn't right, that Carlton was hiding something significant, and Nicole wasn't the only one beginning to question the narrative, because Vanessa, ever observant and unwilling to ignore the subtle shifts in dynamics, began piecing together fragments of conversations, stolen glances, and inconsistencies that pointed to a truth far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. But even Vanessa couldn't have predicted the magnitude of what Shanice and Carlton were hiding, because their secret wasn't just about the past, it was about the present, and more importantly, the future. As tensions escalated, Shanice found herself caught between two worlds, the life she had built and the truth she had buried, and the weight of that secret began to show in the way her voice trembled during seemingly ordinary conversations, in the way she lingered in empty rooms as if gathering the strength to face what she knew was coming, because she understood better than anyone that secrets like this didn't stay hidden forever, and when they surfaced, they didn't just ripple through lives, they detonated them. Carlton, on the other hand, was unraveling in his own way, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack under the pressure, because he had more to lose than anyone, his relationships, his reputation, his carefully curated identity, all of it hinged on keeping the truth buried, but the deeper he tried to bury it, the more it demanded to be acknowledged, to be confronted, and as his behavior grew increasingly erratic, those closest to him couldn't ignore it any longer, especially Nicole, who finally reached a breaking point, confronting Carlton in a moment that would change everything, her questions sharp, her tone unwavering, demanding answers he wasn't prepared to give, and in that moment, the tension that had been building for so long reached a boiling point, because Carlton knew that the truth was no longer something he could control, and Shanice, watching from the shadows of her own fear, realized that the moment she had dreaded was finally here, the moment when the past and present would collide in a way that would leave nothing untouched. What no one expected, however, was the true nature of their secret, because it wasn't just about a past romance or a hidden affair. It was about a decision they had made together, a decision that had consequences far beyond what either of them had anticipated, and that decision had resulted in something, or rather, someone, that neither of them could deny any longer. And when that truth finally came to light, it didn't just shock Fairmont Crest, it shattered it, because the revelation connected dots no one had even realized existed, linking lives, choices, and secrets in a web so intricate that unraveling it would take more than just one confrontation. It would take everything, and as the fallout began, alliances shifted, relationships fractured, and the delicate balance of power within Fairmont Crest was thrown into chaos. Because secrets like this didn't just expose the truth, they forced everyone to reevaluate everything they thought they knew, and in the aftermath, one thing became painfully clear. Shanice and Carlton's secret wasn't just their burden anymore. It belonged to everyone now, and the consequences would be felt in ways no one could predict, because in a place like Fairmont Crest, where appearances were everything and truth was often a luxury, a secret of this magnitude didn't just change the game, it rewrote it entirely, leaving everyone scrambling to pick up the pieces of a reality that would never be the same again. If that revelation was the spark, then what followed was the wildfire no one in Fairmont Crest could outrun, because the moment Shanice and Carlton's truth slipped into the open, first in hushed whispers, then in sharp, undeniable confrontations, it began reshaping every relationship in ways both immediate and deeply insidious, and what made it even more devastating wasn't just the fact that they had shared a hidden past, but that the consequences of that past had been quietly living among them, breathing the same air, forming bonds, unknowingly standing at the center of a lie so intricate that its exposure felt almost surreal. Nicole was the first to truly feel the ground shift beneath her, because for her, this wasn't gossip or scandal, it was betrayal in its purest form, the kind that doesn't just wound but rewrites memory itself, forcing her to question every moment she had ever shared with Carlton, every word he had spoken, every reassurance he had given, and as the realization settled in, it became impossible for her to separate the man she thought she knew from the man who had hidden something so monumental, and that internal conflict turned outward quickly, erupting in a confrontation so raw and unfiltered that even those who only caught fragments of it could feel its intensity ripple through the community, because Nicole didn't just want answers. She demanded accountability, and Carlton, for the first time, found himself unable to deflect, unable to charm his way out, unable to reconstruct the narrative into something manageable, because the truth, once exposed, had a way of stripping away all defenses, leaving only the stark, unvarnished reality behind. Meanwhile, Shanice faced a different kind of reckoning, one that was quieter but no less devastating, because her struggle wasn't just with the people around her. It was with herself, with the choices she had made and the person she had become in order to live with them, and as much as she had convinced herself that she had moved on, that she had built something separate and untouchable from that past, the reality now staring back at her made it clear that the past had never really let her go. It had simply waited, patient and persistent, for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. And now that moment had arrived, bringing with it a flood of emotions she had long suppressed: regret, fear, longing, and perhaps most dangerously, a lingering connection to Carlton that refused to be neatly categorized or dismissed. What complicated everything further was the reaction of those on the periphery, because in a place like Fairmont Crest, no secret exists in isolation. Every revelation creates shockwaves that touch even those who seem only tangentially connected, and Vanessa, who had always prided herself on seeing the truth beneath the surface, now found herself grappling with the unsettling realization that even she had missed something this significant, and that miscalculation shook her confidence in ways she hadn't anticipated, pushing her to dig deeper, to question more aggressively, to refuse to accept half-truths or carefully crafted explanations, because if Shanice and Carlton could hide something of this magnitude, what else was lurking just out of sight? At the same time, others began to reassess their own positions, Alliances that once felt solid now seemed uncertain. Conversations became loaded with subtext, and trust, once freely given, became a rare and fragile commodity, parceled out with caution if at all, because the exposure of one secret had illuminated a harsh truth about Fairmont Crest itself, that it was a place built as much on illusion as on reality, and once that illusion was cracked, even slightly, it became impossible to ignore the fractures running beneath the surface. Yet perhaps the most shocking element of all was not the secret itself, but the implications it carried moving forward, because this wasn't a revelation that could be neatly contained or resolved with a single apology or explanation. It was a living, evolving truth, one that would continue to shape decisions, influence relationships, and create new conflicts long after the initial shock had faded. And as people began to process what had happened, it became clear that the Real story was only just beginning, because secrets like this don't end when they're revealed. They transform, taking on new forms, creating new tensions, and forcing everyone involved to confront not just what has been, but what comes next. For Carlton, that meant facing the reality that control, something he had relied on for so long, was now an illusion, that the narrative was no longer his to shape, and that every choice he made moving forward would be scrutinized, questioned, and weighed against the truth he had tried so hard to conceal. While for Shanice, it meant deciding whether to continue living in the shadow of that past or to finally step into the light, consequences and all, knowing that doing so could cost her everything she had built, but might also be the only way to reclaim a sense of authenticity she had long sacrificed. And for everyone else, it meant navigating a world that suddenly felt less certain, less stable, but perhaps, in some ways, more honest, because while the truth had brought chaos, it had also stripped away the comfortable illusions that had allowed so many to avoid difficult realities. And in that sense, Shanice and Carlton's secret, as shocking and destructive as it was, had also become a catalyst, forcing change in a place that had long resisted it. And as the dust began to settle, if it could even be called settling, it was clear that Fairmont Crest would never be the same again, not because of the secret itself, but because of what it had revealed about the people who lived there, the choices they made, and the truths they were willing or unwilling to face. And just when it seemed like Fairmont Crest had absorbed the worst of the shock, the truth began to evolve in a way that made the original revelation feel almost like a prelude rather than the main event, because secrets of this magnitude rarely exist in isolation. They are usually tied to other choices, other lies, other moments that seemed insignificant at the time but now carried enormous weight. And that's exactly what started to surface as the days passed and the emotional fallout refused to settle into anything resembling normalcy. The community itself became divided into quiet factions, not openly declared but clearly felt, where loyalty and suspicion walked hand in hand, and every conversation seemed to carry an undercurrent of "what else don't we know?" which only intensified as new inconsistencies began to emerge, particularly around the timeline Shanice and Carlton had tried so carefully to maintain, because the more people revisited past events with fresh eyes, the more gaps they found, moments that didn't quite align, explanations that now felt rehearsed, and decisions that suddenly seemed driven by motives no one had previously questioned. And at the center of all of it was the undeniable truth that whatever Shanice and Carlton had shared hadn't simply ended, it had lingered, shaping their actions in subtle but profound ways long after they claimed to have moved on. Nicole, who had initially been fueled by anger and betrayal, began to shift into something far more dangerous: determination, because she wasn't satisfied with the surface-level truth anymore. She wanted the full story, every detail, every decision, every consequence, and that relentless pursuit started to uncover layers even Shanice and Carlton hadn't anticipated being exposed, forcing them into a position where silence was no longer a shield but a liability, because every unanswered question only deepened suspicion, and every attempt to deflect only added fuel to a fire that was already burning out of control. Meanwhile, Shanice found herself confronting a reality she had long tried to avoid, that the secret she had carried wasn't just about protecting herself or even Carlton, it was about protecting someone else, someone whose life had been quietly shaped by decisions made long before they had any say in the matter, and as that realization took hold, it shifted her perspective in a way that made inaction impossible, because whatever fear had kept her silent before now paled in comparison to the potential harm of continuing to hide the truth, especially as the people around her began to piece things together in ways that were increasingly close to the reality she had tried so hard to conceal. Carlton, on the other hand, began to unravel more visibly, the pressure of maintaining even fragments of the old narrative becoming too much to sustain. And what made it worse was the growing awareness that control had never really been his to begin with, that the illusion of stability he had built his life on was just that, an illusion, and now that it had been shattered, he was left navigating a landscape where every move carried consequences he couldn't fully predict, and every attempt to fix things seemed to create new complications rather than resolve existing ones, which only deepened the sense of inevitability that the full truth was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. And then came the moment that shifted everything yet again, the moment when speculation turned into confirmation, when the fragments of suspicion coalesced into a reality that could no longer be denied or softened. And it didn't happen in a dramatic public reveal as some might have expected, but in a quieter, more intimate confrontation that carried far more emotional weight, because it involved the very person Shanice had been trying to protect all along. And when that person finally learned the truth, not just the existence of the secret but the depth of it, the years of silence, the reasons behind the choices that had shaped their life, the reaction wasn't explosive in the way many had anticipated, but something far more devastating. A quiet, profound sense of disorientation, the kind that comes from realizing that the foundation of your identity has been built on something incomplete, something withheld, something that changes how you see not just others, but yourself. That moment didn't just affect Shanice and Carlton. It rippled outward in ways that forced everyone connected to them to confront uncomfortable questions about honesty, responsibility, and the cost of protecting the past at the expense of the present. And it marked a turning point where the narrative could no longer be controlled by those who had created the secret, because it now belonged to someone else, someone who would ultimately decide what to do with it, how to respond to it, and whether to forgive or walk away entirely. As the aftermath of that revelation began to take shape, Fairmont Crest found itself in a state of uneasy transition, where nothing was fully resolved but everything had been irrevocably changed, and the most compelling question was no longer, what is the secret, but what happens now? Because the answer to that question would determine not just the fate of Shanice and Carlton, but the future of every relationship touched by their choices. And if there was one thing everyone had learned by now, it was that in a place built on carefully maintained appearances, the truth doesn't just disrupt, it transforms, often in ways that no one sees coming until it's far too late to turn back.